Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Elite Medical School.
Yes,
with
boy.
me. What's up, guys? How you been? How's it been hanging?
Just had an overnight shift, man, but I'm feeling fired up about, I'm feeling hyperthyroidemic.
Hyperthyroidemia.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's great, and very apropos of our discussion for today, which is, I think, thyroid disorders more generally. Very, very common, particularly in the naturopathic sciences of physical sciences. You'll run into a lot of thyroid issues and adrenal issues, but in fact, it is a common modifiable complaint and high yield for examination purposes. So why don't we just get right into it? Just jump in, feet first, hit the ground running.
Oh yeah.
What shall we start with? Do you want to start with hypothyroidism?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a little bit more high yield. So let's go right into that one. So hypothyroidism, this is a diagnosis that is based entirely on lab values, although, we typically think of a variety of symptoms that are associated with this illness. There's a couple subtypes. We have our overt versus our subclinical subtypes. Thinking back to our hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, we have our TRH, our TSH releasing hormone that's released from the hypothalamus, which then results in TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, released from the anterior pituitary, which acts on the thyroid in order to release our thyroid hormones. And we have a feedback loop associated with this axis that such that if there is low thyroid hormones T3, T4, this will result in an elevated TSH. So whenever we're suspecting hypothyroidism, TSH is going to be our first test here. And we would be anticipating an elevated TSH with the hypothyroidism.
Is there an exception to that rule?
I guess in terms of if we're thinking central hypothyroidism, like if there's a hypothalamic or pituitary issue where we're thinking like trauma or malignancy, then that would lead to a low TSH, and we essentially get like secondary hypothyroidism. That's more of a rarer cause, but certainly something that I guess clinically, rather than using TSH as a marker of our diagnosis and treatment, we will be trending our T4 instead. Which, speaking of which, if getting back to the subtypes, so we're suspecting hypothyroidism, we see TSH is elevated. If afterwards we measure our free T4 and see that that is low, then this is overt hypothyroidism. We know that the actual acting thyroid hormone is not doing its job in the body. But otherwise, if the T4 level is normal, then this can be considered subclinical hypothyroidism.
Right. I think that was a super useful overview. And as from the top, we had mentioned about this being quite a common occurrence. Even up to 5% of the all comers and closer to 10% of women, especially over the age of 50, will be affected. So 10% at some point in their lifetime. The other feature is probably more common in more petite folks or those who have a history of premature birth. So those are a higher risk population. There is a familial component. It's not super strong, but there is a familial component as well. In terms of various etiologies, do we want to endeavor to explain some of those?
Right. So I guess the most common etiologies will vary based on where you are in the world. I know there's some areas of the world that are in a bit of disarray right now because we're a week overdue for uploading this podcast, and that this has resulted in some some, issues in the Gaza Strip,
Yeah.
West
Some
Bank.
geopolitical instability.
Yeah, and we really
Mm.
apologize for that, guys. So, as a special cultural episode, we will,
We will be circumcising Dr. P.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
Maybe have a circumcision then.
and my banjo cord is going to be donated to somebody that needs an ACL.
Fresh banjo cord, live donor banjo cord.
Yeah.
Um,
So we're a philanthropic bunch here. So anyway, worldwide, the most common cause of hypothyroidism would be iodine deficiency, so lack of iodine in our diet. I think worldwide, it's the number one cause of preventable intellectual disability. Yeah,
Cretinism.
exactly.
You damn cretin. Yeah, I don't think that's a sensitive term anymore, by the way. So let's try to avoid that. But yeah, congenital hypothyroidism. Yeah.
Yeah. Thankfully, we fortify our table salt with iodine in our region.
Not if it's kosher.
Oh, really, eh?
Yeah. So just bring awareness to that.
And then, speaking of cretinism, do we maybe want to jump into what features they have? Does anybody know a good mnemonic?
I don't. I'm fascinated.
Oh.
I have bated breath waiting to find out what that is.
Yeah. So it's called the 6 Ps is what I've seen. So we're thinking pale, that pallor, pot belly. It's going to be a puffy-faced child who will have a protuberant tongue, as well as a protruding umbilicus. And the last P is for poor brain development.
Yeah, no, that's useful. No, I like that. And that's good for exam purposes. Okay. So,
yeah,
that's sort of cretinism. And like you point out, probably or is the most common cause internationally of hypothyroidism. In North America, probably the most common cause is Hashimoto's, which is a chronic autoimmune thyroiditis, and is more common, at least twofold. 2 to 7-fold, quite a range, more common in in women. And pathologically, it's like a lymphocytic infiltrate into the thyroid in the acute phase. Like any thyroiditis, there can be increased T4 secretion, whereas in the subacute and chronic phase, there's actually tissue necrosis or loss of secreting cells, and therefore there tends to be a chronic hypothyroidism after this acute inflammation. The more common in women in sort of their 20s and later, very uncommon prepubescent. So not a high index of suspicion there. Other relevant important causes for testing purposes as well. Medications. Okay, so lithium, amiodarone, and iodine, radioactive iodine, we obviously would ablate it. But amiodarone and lithium are the two medications where you do routinely monitor thyroid function. So very, very relevant for our psychiatry colleagues and cardiology colleagues as well. So I think that's an outline of probably the most common causes of, again, primary hypothyroidism, which represent more than 90% of cases. In terms of central, we already referred to this, which is pituitary and hypothalamus. Pituitary damage, trauma would be the most common cause. The other one that people like to pimp students on is Sheehan syndrome, which is seen in related to exsanguination or hemorrhagic, let's say postpartum hemorrhage, bleeding around pregnancy or around childbirth, I should say.